Sarah Martinez had always been different from other soldiers in her unit. While her fellow Marines joked and played cards during downtime, she spent hours cleaning her rifle and studying tactical manuals. Her commanding officers noticed her dedication, but even they couldn't have predicted what was coming. The remote outpost in the mountains had been quiet for weeks. Too quiet, according to Sarah. She had mentioned her concerns to Lieutenant Collins multiple times, pointing out the unusual absence of local traffic on the nearby road, and the way the birds had stopped singing in the mornings. Her instincts, sharpened by 3 tours of duty, were screaming that something was wrong. It was a Thursday morning when Sarah volunteered for the overnight watch duty. Her fellow soldiers were grateful for the extra rest, not knowing they were about to face the longest night of their lives. The outpost housed 12 soldiers, but only Sarah would be awake to see the first signs of the approaching danger. As the sun set behind the jagged peaks, Sarah positioned herself at the main watchtower. The outpost was strategically located on a hill, giving them a clear view of the valley below. 3 access routes led to their position: a main road from the east, a narrow mountain path from the north, and a steep rocky trail from the south. Sarah had memorized every rock, every tree, every possible hiding spot within a 2-mile radius. The first unusual sign came at 11:47 p.m. Sarah noticed a brief flash of light from the eastern ridge, quickly followed by 2 more from different positions. It wasn't lightning, and it wasn't random. Someone was signaling. Her heart rate increased as she reached for her radio, but before she could call for backup, the communications equipment went dead. The enemy had jammed their signals. Sarah's training kicked in immediately. She moved silently through the outpost, waking each soldier with a gentle hand over their mouth and urgent whispers. Within minutes, the entire unit was awake and armed. Lieutenant Collins took command, positioning the soldiers at strategic points around the perimeter. They had practiced this scenario dozens of times, but no training could have prepared them for what was about to unfold. The attack began at exactly midnight. The enemy had chosen their timing perfectly, using the darkness as cover while launching a coordinated assault from all 3 access routes. Sarah counted at least 25 muzzle flashes from the eastern approach alone. The sound of gunfire echoed through the valley as bullets struck the concrete walls of their fortified position. Within the first 10 minutes of the battle, it became clear that they were severely outnumbered. The enemy forces had night vision equipment and were using suppressed weapons, making it difficult to pinpoint their exact locations. Lieutenant Collins made the difficult decision to call for immediate evacuation, but their radio remained jammed. They were completely cut off from outside help. The first casualty came 20 minutes into the fight. Private Johnson, barely 19 years old, took a bullet to the shoulder while manning the southern checkpoint. Sarah immediately moved to provide medical assistance, applying pressure to the wound while continuing to return fire. The enemy was closing in, and their ammunition supplies were already running low. As the battle intensified, Sarah noticed something troubling about the enemy's tactics. They weren't just trying to overrun the position, they were systematically targeting specific defensive points. Someone had provided them with detailed intelligence about the outpost's layout. This wasn't a random attack, it was a carefully planned operation designed to eliminate every soldier in the unit. The realization hit Sarah like a physical blow. They weren't just facing superior numbers, they were fighting an enemy who knew exactly how to exploit their weaknesses. The strategic positioning of the outpost, which had seemed like an advantage, was now working against them. They were trapped on the hilltop with nowhere to retreat. Lieutenant Collins gathered the remaining soldiers for a quick tactical assessment. The situation was grim. They had lost 2 more men in the past hour, and ammunition was running critically low. The enemy forces had established positions on all sides, effectively surrounding the outpost. Escape seemed impossible, but surrender wasn't an option either. Sarah volunteered to attempt a breakthrough on the northern route, hoping to reach the backup communications equipment stored in a bunker half a mile away. It was a suicide mission, but someone had to try. As she prepared to leave the relative safety of the outpost, Lieutenant Collins pulled her aside for what both of them knew might be their final conversation. The lieutenant handed Sarah his personal sidearm and the unit's emergency flares. If she couldn't reach help, at least she could signal their position to any friendly forces in the area. Sarah tucked the flares into her vest and checked her primary weapon one last time. The night was far from over, and the real test of her courage was just beginning. As Sarah prepared to venture into the darkness, she took one last look at her fellow soldiers. These men had become her family over the past 18 months. They had shared meals, jokes, fears, and dreams. Now they were depending on her to save their lives. The weight of responsibility was crushing, but Sarah had never backed down from a challenge in her life. The enemy fire had temporarily decreased, suggesting they might be regrouping for another major assault. This brief lull gave Sarah the opportunity she needed to begin her dangerous mission. She moved toward the northern exit, staying low and using the shadows as cover. Every step took her further from her unit and deeper into enemy territory. Just as Sarah reached the perimeter fence, a massive explosion rocked the outpost. The enemy had brought heavy weapons, and the main building was now partially destroyed. Through the smoke and debris, she could hear Lieutenant Collins shouting orders to the remaining soldiers. There was no time to waste. Sarah cut through the fence and disappeared into the darkness, knowing that the next few hours would determine whether any of them would live to see the sunrise. The mountain path was treacherous in daylight, but navigating it at night, while under enemy fire, required skills that went beyond standard military training. Sarah had grown up hiking these mountains with her grandfather, a veteran who had taught her to read the landscape like a book. That childhood knowledge was now the difference between life and death. As she moved through the darkness, Sarah could hear the battle raging behind her. The sound of gunfire was constant now, punctuated by the occasional explosion. Her fellow soldiers were fighting for their lives, and every minute she spent in the wilderness was another minute they had to hold their position against impossible odds. The first mile of her journey was the most dangerous. Enemy scouts could be anywhere, and Sarah had to assume that every shadow concealed a potential threat. She moved in short bursts, pausing frequently to listen for any sounds that didn't belong to the natural environment. Her military training had taught her patience, but her heart was urging her to move faster. When Sarah finally reached the communications bunker, she discovered that it too had been compromised. The enemy had found it first and destroyed all the equipment inside. Her mission had failed before it had truly begun. She was alone in enemy territory with no way to call for help and no clear path back to her unit. Standing in the ruins of the bunker, Sarah faced the most difficult decision of her military career. She could attempt to return to the outpost and die alongside her fellow soldiers, or she could try to fight her way through enemy lines and seek help from a friendly position 20 miles away. Either choice carried enormous risks, but only one offered any hope of saving her unit. Sarah made her decision. She would fight her way through the enemy forces and bring back help, no matter how long it took or what obstacles she faced. As she prepared to begin the most dangerous night of her life, she whispered a prayer for her fellow soldiers and promised herself that she would not let them down. The real battle was just beginning, and Sarah Martinez was ready to face whatever challenges lay ahead in the darkness. Sarah's journey through the mountains began with a series of near-impossible challenges. The enemy forces had established a network of checkpoints throughout the valley, making any direct route to friendly territory extremely dangerous. She had to rely on her knowledge of the terrain and her survival skills to navigate through areas that no military manual had ever prepared her for. The first enemy patrol found her within 30 minutes of leaving the destroyed bunker. Sarah had been moving along a narrow ridge when she heard voices below. 3 enemy soldiers were walking directly toward her position, their flashlights cutting through the darkness like deadly beacons. She had seconds to decide between fighting and hiding. Sarah chose to fight. She had learned long ago that hesitation in combat was often fatal. Using the element of surprise, she took down the first soldier with a precise shot before the others could react. The second enemy fighter managed to raise his weapon, but Sarah was already moving, using the rocky terrain as cover while she engaged him in close combat. The third soldier proved more challenging. He was experienced and well-trained, matching Sarah's movements with tactical precision. Their battle lasted several minutes, with both fighters using every available piece of cover as they exchanged gunfire across the narrow ridge. Sarah finally gained the advantage by using a risky maneuver she had learned during mountain warfare training. After defeating the patrol, Sarah realized that her situation had become even more desperate. The gunfire would have alerted other enemy units to her presence, and they would be actively hunting her now. She had to move faster and take greater risks if she hoped to reach help in time to save her fellow soldiers. The mountain trails became increasingly treacherous as Sarah pushed deeper into enemy territory. She encountered 2 more patrols over the next hour, each time forced to engage in combat that depleted her ammunition and energy reserves. The enemy forces were well organized and persistent, never allowing her more than a few minutes of rest between encounters. During a brief pause behind a large boulder, Sarah assessed her situation. She had started the night with standard combat gear, but the continuous fighting had taken its toll. Her body armor was damaged, her primary weapon was nearly out of ammunition, and she was beginning to feel the physical strain of hours of intense combat. The fourth enemy encounter occurred at a narrow bridge spanning a deep ravine. Sarah had hoped to cross quickly and continue toward friendly territory, but enemy soldiers had established a checkpoint at the far end. She counted at least 6 fighters, all armed with automatic weapons and positioned to control access to the bridge. Sarah spent 20 minutes studying the enemy positions before making her move. The checkpoint was too well defended for a direct assault, so she decided to create a diversion. Using her remaining explosive charges, she triggered a controlled avalanche on the opposite side of the ravine, drawing the attention of most of the enemy soldiers. While the enemy fighters investigated the explosion, Sarah made her move across the bridge. She managed to eliminate 3 soldiers before the others realized what was happening. The ensuing firefight was intense but brief, ending when Sarah used her superior position to outflank the remaining enemies. Crossing the bridge marked a significant milestone in Sarah's journey, but it also brought new challenges. The terrain on the far side was more open, offering less cover but allowing for faster movement. She could see lights in the distance that might indicate friendly forces, but reaching them would require crossing several miles of exposed ground. The enemy response to her presence was becoming more coordinated. Sarah began to notice patterns in their patrol routes and communication signals that suggested a central command was directing the search for her. They were treating her as a high-value target, dedicating significant resources to tracking her down. As the night progressed, Sarah's tactical thinking evolved. She stopped trying to avoid enemy contact entirely and began using the encounters to her advantage. Each defeated patrol provided her with additional ammunition and equipment, gradually improving her combat effectiveness despite the physical exhaustion. The 6th major encounter occurred near a small village that Sarah had hoped to bypass entirely. Enemy forces had established a temporary command post in the village center, with patrols radiating outward to control the surrounding area. Sarah realized that destroying this command post might disrupt their ability to coordinate the search for her. Sarah spent an hour observing the enemy positions and planning her assault. The command post was heavily defended, but it also contained valuable resources including communications equipment and ammunition supplies. A successful attack could significantly improve her chances of completing the mission. The assault on the village required all of Sarah's combat skills and tactical knowledge. She began by eliminating the outer sentries silently, using techniques she had learned during specialized training courses. Each successful elimination brought her closer to the command post while reducing the enemy's ability to respond to her presence. The main assault on the command post was Sarah's most challenging battle yet. The enemy fighters were elite troops, well-trained and heavily armed. The battle raged through the village streets for over an hour, with both sides using buildings and vehicles as cover while exchanging intense gunfire. Sarah's breakthrough came when she managed to reach the communications equipment. Instead of destroying it immediately, she used it to intercept enemy radio traffic and learn about their overall tactical situation. What she discovered was both encouraging and terrifying. Her fellow soldiers were still alive and fighting, but they were down to their last reserves of ammunition. The intelligence she gathered revealed that the enemy forces attacking her outpost numbered over 80 fighters, far more than she had initially estimated. They were part of a larger operation designed to eliminate several military positions in the region. Her unit was just one target in a coordinated campaign. Armed with this new information, Sarah made a crucial decision. Instead of continuing toward friendly territory to seek help, she would return to the outpost and use her knowledge of enemy positions to break the siege. It was an almost impossible mission, but it was the only way to save her fellow soldiers in time. The journey back toward the outpost presented new challenges. Sarah now had to cross terrain that was actively patrolled by enemy forces looking for her. She used every trick she had learned during her military career, moving like a ghost through the mountains while avoiding detection. Her first major obstacle was a checkpoint that had been established since her initial passage through the area. The enemy had learned from her previous attacks and positioned their forces more strategically. Sarah spent 2 hours finding a way past them without triggering an alarm that would compromise her mission. As Sarah moved closer to the outpost, she could hear the ongoing battle. The sound of gunfire was sporadic now, suggesting that both sides were conserving ammunition for critical moments. She knew that time was running out for her fellow soldiers, and she had to act quickly to make a difference. The final approach to the outpost required careful planning. Sarah positioned herself on the eastern ridge where she had first noticed the enemy signals hours earlier. From this vantage point, she could observe the entire battlefield and identify the best opportunities to disrupt the enemy assault. What she saw confirmed her worst fears. The outpost was completely surrounded, and the enemy forces were preparing for a final assault that would overwhelm her fellow soldiers. The main building was heavily damaged, and she could see only 3 defensive positions still active. Her unit was down to perhaps 5 or 6 fighters at most. Sarah realized that her only chance of success was to create enough chaos and confusion to break the enemy's coordination. She would have to attack multiple positions simultaneously, making them believe they were facing a much larger force. It was a desperate plan, but desperation had become her closest companion during this endless night. As she prepared for what might be her final battle, Sarah thought about the soldiers depending on her. Lieutenant Collins, who had trusted her with this mission. Private Johnson, wounded but still fighting. All the others who had become her family during their deployment. She would not let them down, no matter the cost to herself. The time for planning was over. Sarah checked her weapons one last time and began moving toward the first enemy position. The most dangerous phase of her mission was about to begin, and she was ready to face whatever challenges awaited her in the darkness. Her fellow soldiers were counting on her, and she had never failed them before. Sarah's assault on the enemy positions began at 4:30 a.m., during the darkest hour before dawn. She had spent the previous 30 minutes studying the enemy formations and identifying their weaknesses. The attackers had grown overconfident during their long siege, allowing gaps to develop in their perimeter that a skilled soldier could exploit. The first target was an enemy machine gun nest positioned on the southern approach to the outpost. This position had been preventing her fellow soldiers from using their southern defensive wall effectively. Sarah approached the position using a drainage ditch that provided concealment until she was within striking distance. The machine gun crew consisted of 3 enemy fighters who had been engaged in the siege for over 6 hours. Their attention was focused entirely on the outpost, making them vulnerable to attack from behind. Sarah eliminated all 3 soldiers within seconds, capturing their heavy weapon and a significant amount of ammunition. Instead of destroying the machine gun position, Sarah turned the weapon around and began using it against the enemy forces attacking from the eastern approach. The sudden shift in fire superiority created immediate confusion among the enemy ranks. They had not anticipated that one of their own positions had been compromised. The psychological impact of Sarah's attack was immediate and significant. The enemy fighters began looking over their shoulders, uncertain about where the next attack might come from. Their coordinated assault began to falter as individual units became more concerned with their own security than with maintaining the siege. Sarah's next target was a mortar position that had been raining explosives on the outpost throughout the night. The mortar crew was located approximately 200 meters from her current position, requiring a dangerous approach across relatively open ground. She used smoke grenades captured from the machine gun nest to provide cover for her movement. The assault on the mortar position proved more challenging than the machine gun nest. The crew was more alert and better positioned to defend against attack. Sarah engaged them in a prolonged firefight that tested all of her combat skills. She eventually prevailed by using the terrain to her advantage, attacking from an unexpected angle that caught the enemy fighters off guard. Capturing the mortar position provided Sarah with even more firepower to use against the besieging forces. She immediately began directing mortar fire at enemy positions that were threatening her fellow soldiers. Each well-placed round disrupted enemy formations and forced them to seek new cover. The third phase of Sarah's counterattack focused on the enemy command structure. She had identified what appeared to be a field headquarters located in a cluster of large rocks on the northern approach. Eliminating the command element would further disrupt the enemy's ability to coordinate their assault. The approach to the enemy headquarters required Sarah to cross a killing field that was covered by multiple enemy positions. She used every piece of available cover while moving in short rushes between concealed positions. The enemy was fully alert now, aware that they were under attack from an unknown force. Sarah's assault on the headquarters position turned into her most intense battle yet. The enemy commanders were elite fighters with extensive combat experience. They had established overlapping fields of fire and were using advanced tactical communications to coordinate their defense. The battle for the headquarters lasted nearly an hour, with both sides using every available weapon and piece of equipment. Sarah's advantage lay in her mobility and her detailed knowledge of the terrain. She could move between positions quickly while the enemy defenders were tied to their static positions. The breakthrough came when Sarah managed to get close enough to use grenades against the enemy positions. The explosions disrupted their defensive coordination and created opportunities for her to assault individual positions one at a time. By the end of the engagement, she had eliminated the entire enemy command structure. With the enemy headquarters neutralized, Sarah turned her attention to the remaining attack positions that were still threatening the outpost. The morning light was beginning to appear on the horizon, which would work to her advantage by allowing her to see enemy positions more clearly. The fourth major engagement occurred when Sarah encountered a group of enemy soldiers who were attempting to organize a retreat. They had realized that their assault had failed and were trying to withdraw to safer positions. Sarah could not allow them to escape and potentially return with reinforcements. The running battle with the retreating enemy forces took Sarah across nearly a mile of mountain terrain. She pursued them relentlessly, engaging multiple small groups while preventing them from forming a cohesive defensive line. Her superior knowledge of the terrain allowed her to anticipate their movements and cut off their escape routes. During this phase of the battle, Sarah began to feel the full effects of the physical exhaustion that had been building throughout the night. She had been fighting continuously for over 7 hours, with minimal rest and no food or water. Her body was operating on pure adrenaline and determination. Despite her exhaustion, Sarah continued to press her attack against the scattered enemy forces. She knew that any enemies who escaped might return with reinforcements, putting her fellow soldiers at risk once again. She was determined to eliminate every threat before allowing herself to rest. The fifth engagement occurred when Sarah discovered a group of enemy soldiers who had taken cover in a natural cave formation. They were well-positioned and heavily armed, presenting a significant challenge to her increasingly depleted resources. She was down to her last magazines of ammunition and had no more explosive devices. Sarah's assault on the cave position required her to use tactics she had never employed in combat before. She created improvised explosive devices using materials scavenged from defeated enemy forces. The homemade bombs were crude but effective, allowing her to attack positions that would have been impossible to assault with conventional weapons. The battle at the cave marked a turning point in Sarah's campaign. She had now been fighting for 8 hours straight and had engaged over 60 enemy fighters. Her ammunition was nearly exhausted, but she had successfully broken the siege of the outpost and eliminated the majority of the attacking force. As the sun rose fully above the mountains, Sarah could finally see the full extent of the battlefield. Bodies and equipment were scattered across the landscape, testament to the intensity of the night's fighting. The outpost itself showed significant damage but was still standing, and she could see movement that indicated her fellow soldiers had survived. Sarah's final challenge was reaching the outpost safely. Several enemy fighters were still active in the area, and she had to assume that some of them were positioned between her current location and her destination. She was exhausted, nearly out of ammunition, and operating on willpower alone. The approach to the outpost required Sarah to cross the same ground where the main enemy assault had taken place hours earlier. The area was littered with obstacles and potential hiding places for enemy fighters. She moved carefully, using every lesson she had learned during the long night of combat. When Sarah finally reached the perimeter of the outpost, she was met by Lieutenant Collins and the 3 surviving members of their unit. The reunion was emotional but brief, as they still had to secure the area and treat the wounded. Sarah's actions had saved their lives, but the mission was not yet complete. The immediate priority was to establish communications with friendly forces and request medical evacuation for the wounded. Sarah used her knowledge of enemy radio procedures, gained during her assault on their command post, to contact Allied units and report their situation. As she made the radio call that would bring help to their isolated position, Sarah reflected on the night's events. She had faced impossible odds and emerged victorious through a combination of skill, determination, and sheer force of will. Her fellow soldiers were alive because she had refused to give up when everything seemed hopeless. The response from Allied forces was swift and decisive. Within hours, helicopters arrived to evacuate the wounded and provide reinforcements to secure the area. Sarah's detailed reports about enemy positions and tactics would prove invaluable for future operations in the region. As the evacuation helicopters lifted off from the battered outpost, Sarah took one last look at the battlefield where she had fought her greatest battle. The mountains that had seemed so threatening in the darkness now appeared peaceful in the morning light. She had faced her ultimate test as a soldier and had not been found wanting. The helicopter evacuation had been delayed due to adverse weather conditions, leaving Sarah and the surviving members of her unit trapped at the outpost for another full day. What they had initially thought was the end of their ordeal was actually just the beginning of an even greater challenge. Enemy reinforcements were already moving toward their position. Sarah's radio intercepts revealed that the failed assault on their outpost was part of a larger military operation. The enemy commanders were not willing to accept defeat and were sending a much larger force to finish what the first attack had started. Intelligence suggested that over 200 enemy fighters were converging on their location from multiple directions. The surviving members of Sarah's unit were in no condition to face another major battle. Private Johnson was still recovering from his shoulder wound, and 2 other soldiers had injuries that significantly limited their combat effectiveness. Lieutenant Collins was determined to fight, but he was realistic about their chances against such overwhelming odds. Sarah volunteered to conduct a reconnaissance mission to gather information about the approaching enemy forces. Her experience from the previous night had proven that mobility and detailed intelligence were their greatest advantages. If they were going to survive another assault, they needed to know exactly what they were facing. The reconnaissance mission took Sarah through terrain that was now littered with evidence of the previous night's battles. She passed the destroyed machine gun nests and mortar positions that had marked her counterattack against the original besieging force. The sight of the battlefield reminded her of what was possible when determination met opportunity. Sarah's first contact with the advancing enemy forces occurred approximately 5 miles from the outpost. She observed a large convoy of vehicles moving along the main road, carrying what appeared to be heavy weapons and specialized equipment. The enemy was not taking any chances with their second assault. From her concealed position on a hillside, Sarah counted at least 40 vehicles in the convoy. Using binoculars captured from enemy forces during the previous battle, she identified artillery pieces, armored personnel carriers, and what appeared to be electronic warfare equipment. The enemy was bringing everything they needed for a prolonged siege. The intelligence-gathering mission revealed that the enemy had learned from their previous failure. Instead of relying on small unit tactics, they were deploying overwhelming firepower and advanced equipment. They intended to destroy the outpost completely rather than risk another failed assault. Sarah's detailed observations allowed her to identify potential weaknesses in the enemy formation. The convoy was strung out along several miles of mountain road, making communication between units difficult. Individual elements were vulnerable to attack if they could be isolated from the main force. The return journey to the outpost gave Sarah time to develop a tactical plan that might give her unit a fighting chance. Instead of waiting for the enemy to reach their position, she would launch preemptive strikes against the advancing forces. It was an ambitious plan that required precise timing and exceptional execution. Back at the outpost, Sarah briefed Lieutenant Collins and the other survivors on what they were facing. The news was sobering, but it also clarified their situation. They could not defend against such a large force using conventional tactics. Their only hope was to disrupt the enemy advance before it could reach full strength. Lieutenant Collins made the difficult decision to authorize Sarah's plan for preemptive strikes against the advancing enemy forces. It meant sending their most effective fighter away from the defensive position when they needed every available soldier. However, the alternative was certain destruction when the enemy reached the outpost. Sarah's preparation for the mission was meticulous. She gathered all available weapons and ammunition, focusing on portable systems that would allow her to remain mobile during extended combat operations. Every piece of equipment had to serve multiple purposes, as she would not be able to resupply during the mission. The first target in Sarah's campaign against the advancing enemy forces was an isolated artillery unit that had stopped to establish a firing position approximately 3 miles from the main convoy. The artillery posed the greatest threat to the outpost, capable of destroying their defensive positions from a safe distance. Sarah's approach to the artillery position required a dangerous journey across open terrain that offered minimal cover. She moved during daylight hours, using natural camouflage and careful timing to avoid detection by enemy scout units that were patrolling the area ahead of the main force. The assault on the artillery position was Sarah's most challenging single engagement yet. The enemy had learned from the previous night's disasters and had established proper security around their heavy weapons. Sarah faced well-trained defenders who were alert and prepared for attack. The battle for the artillery position lasted nearly 2 hours, with Sarah using every tactic she had learned during her military career. She employed deception, misdirection, and superior marksmanship to gradually eliminate the enemy defenders. The captured artillery pieces gave her the firepower needed to attack the main convoy. Sarah's use of the captured artillery against the enemy convoy created chaos and confusion in their ranks. The enemy commanders had not anticipated that their own weapons would be turned against them. Several vehicles were destroyed before the convoy could disperse and seek cover. The success of the artillery attack forced the enemy to change their tactical approach. Instead of advancing as a single coordinated force, they broke into smaller units that were harder to target with indirect fire. This change worked to Sarah's advantage, as smaller units were more vulnerable to individual attack. Sarah's second major engagement occurred when she intercepted an enemy reconnaissance unit that was attempting to establish observation posts around the outpost. These positions would have allowed the enemy to direct accurate fire against her fellow soldiers. Eliminating them was essential for the survival of her unit. The battle against the reconnaissance unit demonstrated Sarah's evolution as a combat leader. She had learned to think strategically about the entire battlefield rather than focusing only on immediate threats. Every engagement was planned to support the overall goal of protecting her fellow soldiers. The enemy response to Sarah's attacks was swift and decisive. They deployed specialized hunter-killer teams with orders to eliminate her at any cost. These elite units were equipped with advanced tracking equipment and communications gear that made them far more dangerous than the regular infantry she had faced before. Sarah's encounters with the hunter-killer teams pushed her skills to their absolute limits. These were professional soldiers with extensive combat experience and superior equipment. The battles were intense and personal, with both sides using every available advantage to gain the upper hand. The third major phase of Sarah's campaign began when she realized that the enemy was using her attacks against the main force to track her movements. They had established a pattern based on her previous engagements and were positioning forces to trap her. She had to change her tactics completely to avoid capture. Sarah's evolution into guerrilla warfare marked a significant shift in her approach to the battle. Instead of seeking decisive engagements, she began using hit-and-run tactics designed to inflict maximum damage while minimizing her exposure to enemy fire. Every attack was planned with multiple escape routes and contingency plans. The psychological warfare aspect of Sarah's campaign became as important as the direct military action. The enemy forces were becoming increasingly nervous and demoralized as their casualties mounted without any clear victory in sight. Individual units began showing signs of reduced effectiveness due to stress and exhaustion. Sarah's fourth major engagement occurred when she encountered the enemy field headquarters that had been established to coordinate the assault on her outpost. The headquarters was heavily defended and represented the heart of the enemy operation. Destroying it would severely disrupt their ability to maintain coordinated attacks. The assault on the enemy headquarters required all of Sarah's accumulated experience and captured equipment. She used artillery fire, direct assault tactics, and psychological warfare to create a complex battle that lasted over 3 hours. The headquarters was eventually destroyed, but at significant cost to her remaining resources. The destruction of the enemy headquarters marked a turning point in the battle. Without central coordination, the various enemy units began operating independently, making them less effective but also more unpredictable. Sarah had to adapt her tactics once again to deal with this new threat pattern. As the second day of combat drew to a close, Sarah realized that she had been fighting almost continuously for over 30 hours. Her body was operating beyond normal human limits, sustained only by adrenaline, determination, and the knowledge that her fellow soldiers' lives depended on her actions. The enemy forces, meanwhile, had been reduced to approximately 60% of their original strength. Sarah's relentless attacks had taken a severe toll on their equipment and morale. However, they still possessed overwhelming numerical superiority and were determined to complete their mission. Sarah's final major engagement of the day occurred when she was forced to defend herself against a coordinated attack by 3 separate enemy units that had finally managed to corner her in a narrow valley. The battle that followed would test every skill she had developed during her military career and push her physical endurance to its absolute breaking point. The narrow valley where Sarah found herself trapped represented the ultimate test of everything she had learned during 30 hours of continuous combat. 3 enemy units, totaling 25 fighters, had coordinated their movements to corner her in terrain that offered limited escape routes. They had finally learned to work together effectively against her guerrilla tactics. Sarah's assessment of the tactical situation was grim, but not hopeless. She had 2 magazines of ammunition remaining for her primary weapon, 3 grenades, and a sidearm with half a magazine. The enemy forces were well-armed and positioned to control all the obvious exit points from the valley. However, her superior knowledge of the terrain might provide options that they had not considered. The enemy assault began with a coordinated advance from 3 directions, designed to compress Sarah's maneuvering space until she had nowhere left to retreat. Their tactics were sound and professionally executed, indicating that these were elite troops who had been specifically trained to hunt down individual targets in difficult terrain. Sarah's response to the coordinated assault demonstrated the tactical evolution she had undergone during the prolonged battle. Instead of seeking cover and fighting defensively, she immediately went on the offensive, attacking the weakest point in the enemy formation before they could fully establish their positions. Her assault on the eastern approach caught the enemy fighters off guard. They had expected her to retreat deeper into the valley, not to attack directly into their advancing forces. Sarah's aggressive tactics allowed her to eliminate 3 enemy soldiers and capture additional ammunition before the other units could respond to support their comrades. The psychological impact of Sarah's immediate counterattack was significant. The enemy forces had been confident that they finally had her trapped, but her aggressive response reminded them that she remained extremely dangerous even when cornered. Their advance became more cautious, giving her additional time to prepare her defenses. Sarah used the brief respite to establish defensive positions in the rocky terrain at the center of the valley. The natural stone formations provided excellent cover while offering multiple firing positions that allowed her to engage targets from unexpected angles. She had learned to use every advantage that the environment could provide. The second phase of the battle began when the enemy forces attempted to use their numerical superiority to overwhelm Sarah's position through concentrated fire. They established a base of fire from covered positions and began advancing individual elements while maintaining suppressive fire on her defensive position. Sarah's response to the suppressive fire tactics required precise timing and perfect marksmanship. She had to emerge from cover long enough to engage advancing enemies while avoiding the concentrated fire from their support positions. Each engagement required split-second timing that left no room for error. The battle intensified as the enemy forces began using more sophisticated tactics. They employed fire and movement techniques that demonstrated advanced training and experience. Sarah found herself facing opponents who were approaching her own level of tactical skill and battlefield experience. The third phase of the engagement occurred when Sarah realized that the enemy was attempting to flank her position by using a concealed approach along the valley floor. She had to abandon her primary defensive position to prevent being surrounded, fighting a running battle while moving to secondary positions. Sarah's movement between defensive positions required her to cross open ground while under fire from multiple directions. She used smoke grenades and suppressive fire to create brief windows of opportunity for movement, but each transition exposed her to significant risk from enemy marksmen. The running battle through the valley showcased Sarah's complete mastery of small unit tactics and individual combat skills. She was fighting multiple enemies simultaneously while moving across difficult terrain, using every available piece of cover and concealment to maintain her effectiveness while avoiding enemy fire. During the fourth phase of the battle, Sarah's ammunition situation became critical. She was down to her last magazine for her primary weapon and had to rely increasingly on captured enemy equipment. Every shot had to count, as there would be no opportunity to resupply during the ongoing engagement. The enemy forces sensed that Sarah's resources were becoming depleted and increased the intensity of their assault. They began taking greater risks, advancing more aggressively in an attempt to overwhelm her before she could establish new defensive positions. The battle reached a crescendo of intensity that tested both sides to their limits. Sarah's breakthrough came when she managed to reach a position that allowed her to use the captured artillery radio to call for fire support from the artillery pieces she had captured earlier. The precise artillery strikes disrupted the enemy formation and created the opportunity she needed to break out of the encirclement. The artillery fire that Sarah directed onto the enemy positions was devastatingly accurate. Her detailed knowledge of the terrain and enemy positions, combined with her experience using the captured equipment, allowed her to place rounds exactly where they would be most effective. The enemy forces were forced to disperse and seek cover. Using the chaos created by the artillery bombardment, Sarah launched her final assault of the battle. She moved aggressively against the scattered enemy forces, engaging them individually before they could reorganize their defensive positions. Her superior battlefield mobility gave her a decisive advantage. The final phase of the Valley battle lasted nearly 2 hours, with Sarah systematically eliminating the remaining enemy fighters while they struggled to coordinate their response to her attacks. Her relentless pressure prevented them from establishing any effective defensive positions. When the battle in the Valley finally ended, Sarah had eliminated all 25 enemy fighters while suffering only minor injuries herself. The engagement had required her to use every skill and piece of equipment at her disposal, representing the culmination of her tactical development during the prolonged campaign. The victory in the Valley marked the effective end of the enemy's second assault on the outpost. Sarah had single-handedly defeated a force that outnumbered her unit by a ratio of more than 20-1. Her actions had saved not only her fellow soldiers, but potentially prevented the enemy from achieving their broader strategic objectives in the region. Sarah's journey back to the outpost after the Valley battle was a time of reflection on the events of the past 2 days. She had faced challenges that pushed human endurance and tactical skill to their absolute limits. Her survival and success represented a combination of training, determination, and circumstances that might never be repeated. The reunion with her surviving unit members was emotional and profound. They had listened to the sounds of battle from their defensive positions, knowing that their survival depended entirely on Sarah's success against overwhelming odds. Her return marked the end of the longest and most difficult mission any of them had ever experienced. Lieutenant Collins immediately established communications with higher headquarters to report the outcome of the engagement and request immediate medical evacuation for all personnel. Sarah's detailed after-action reports would become required reading at military academies, representing a textbook example of individual initiative and tactical excellence. The medical evaluation that followed revealed the full extent of what Sarah had endured during her 40-hour campaign. She had lost over 20 pounds, suffered multiple minor injuries, and shown signs of severe exhaustion that should have made continued combat impossible. Her performance had transcended normal human limitations. The official investigation into the engagement documented that Sarah had personally engaged and defeated 85 enemy fighters over the course of 8 hours of continuous combat. The precision of her tactics and the effectiveness of her individual actions had prevented what should have been a decisive enemy victory. Sarah's actions during the siege became legendary within military circles, but she remained modest about her accomplishments. She consistently emphasized that her success was only possible because of the training she had received and the support of her fellow soldiers. Her perspective on the events remained grounded in the realities of military service. The strategic impact of Sarah's victory extended far beyond the immediate tactical situation. The enemy forces had committed significant resources to operations that ended in complete failure, disrupting their broader campaign plans throughout the region. Her individual actions had influenced the outcome of a much larger conflict. The awards and recognition that followed acknowledged Sarah's exceptional performance, but they could not fully capture the significance of what she had accomplished. She had proven that individual determination and tactical skill could overcome seemingly impossible odds when applied with intelligence and courage. Sarah's story became an inspiration for soldiers around the world, demonstrating that ordinary people could achieve extraordinary things when faced with critical situations. Her example showed that proper training, combined with unwavering determination, could overcome challenges that seemed insurmountable. Years later, Sarah continued her military career with the knowledge that she had faced the ultimate test of a soldier's abilities and had not been found wanting. The lessons she learned during those 40 hours of combat would influence her approach to every subsequent challenge, both military and civilian. The outpost where Sarah made her stand was eventually converted into a training facility where military personnel could study the tactics and decision-making that had led to her remarkable victory. Her story became part of the curriculum, ensuring that future generations of soldiers would benefit from her experience. Sarah Martinez had entered the battle as an experienced but relatively unknown soldier. She emerged as a legend whose actions would be studied and admired for generations to come. Her victory against 85 enemies in 8 hours of continuous combat represented the pinnacle of individual military achievement and human determination.